retiring soon because I thought it already happened. And you have to talk to him afterwards. He has this cool app on his pad, and it's a countdown to the very second that he retires. Man, you know that's him. Yeah, he knows exactly. Now, if we knew when we were going to heaven, would you have a countdown app for that as well? Wouldn't that be exciting? You can make preparations. You know that day's coming. But we know whether we know the moment or not, we are all assuredly convicted, I'm going to heaven. That's why we sing these songs, this world's not my home, I'm just passing through. I know that there's a place beyond the blue. I didn't get that exactly right. Now, but we're excited. We're excited to go to heaven. And it gives us the ability and the power to go through this life right now. And retirement is a big part of this life. And because of that, we have IRAs, 401ks. We worry about Social Security and our investments because we want to know, will we have enough to live off of and do the things we want once we stop working? Well, more importantly, we want to make sure that when we pass from this earth, we have a heavenly retirement. We have a home to live there. That we have a place that we can call our own. And that's the hope of a Christian. It's not just a wish. We know there is a place. And so we want to live on this earth like we're leaving. And so the question we ask is, okay, I know I'm going. How do you, Lord, want me to live now while I'm waiting to get there? Is there anything you want me to do? We saw last week, life on this earth's a test. God gives us little life lessons in the form of challenges, and we see them as burdens or trials or temptations, but they're really tests. You don't learn the lesson until after you've gone through the trial, then you look back, oh, thank you, Lord. And then sometimes we keep going through the same trial over and over because we haven't learned the lesson. But we're going to see this morning that God wants us to make investments. These are the greatest financial investments that you can make. And they are financial because they're great. It's because they're also involved a spiritual investment as well. And that's where we looked at the text that Josiah read for us. And again, I want you to open your Bibles to that place in Matthew chapter 6, in verse 19 through 24. Jesus is speaking here on what we call the Sermon on the Mount. He's right in the middle of it. He's going to talk about being anxious for physical things while you're on this earth. And so he gives three imperatives. And the first imperative is in our section where he says, do not lay up for yourself treasures on this earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Now that's the first imperative. This is the first command. Lay up treasures in heaven. Now he first states it in a negative before he explains the positive for emphasis, but we're going to explain them both. And what we're going to see here simply, and it's very powerful as we unpack this text, we can have eternal treasures in heaven by simple acts of service while we live on this earth. It's really quite easy to do. And the rewards they're amazing. They're above our imagination. And that's what Jesus is trying to get us to understand. So we're going to look at this lesson in 2 points only. It's really quite simple. First of all, store up or accumulate treasures in heaven. And we'll look at the negative and then the positive. But then the question is, well, how do I store up those treasures in heaven? And we'll give you the simple ways that you can do that. But first of all, let's consider just what he has to say about storing up treasures in heaven. First of all, there's the negative statement. We have to deal with that. And it's given in the negative for impact. First of all, he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth. Now, verse 20, you see the but word? But lay up treasure. This is a classic not but clause. And what's that? And when we study the Bible, we see that sometimes you'll say, don't do this, but do this. There's a contrast. Now, most often, when he says don't do this, it's not that they're wrong in of themselves, but this is so much more important, you don't want to give attention to that. It's not wrong to have treasures on this earth, but more importantly, your focus and priority should be treasures in heaven. And if you get caught up in making treasures on this earth, you won't be able to do treasures where they really are important. That's in heaven. So I want you to see that. It's a not but clause. Not this. I mean, that's grade school stuff. You want something really valuable. And it's storing up for yourself treasures in heaven. And so that's the negative, not on this earth. It's the idea of priority. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 32, later in this same chapter, when he's talking about don't being anxious, for all these things the Gentiles seek, your heavenly Father knows you need all these things. So he says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all this other stuff will be given to you, food, shelter, and clothing. The word first means protos in the Greek, and it's first place, first before everything. It's talking about top of the list priority. So young guy's dating a girl. Says, hey, I'd like to marry you. Would you marry me? He says, well, yes. But will I be first in your life? Yes, you'll be first. But oh, Mary Jane, I still like her. She'll be second, and then Julie will be third. Would that work? No. First means what? Top priority, nothing else. What if the man says, yeah, you'll be first in my life, but hunting will be a close second, or whatever. My cars will be a third. No, first means what? Top, preeminent. That's what he says. Seek first his kingdom. I'm just asking you a question. You answer it personally yourself, because I have to ask myself. Am I seeking God's kingdom first above everything else? That's a yes, or it's no. Are there other things that have my energy and my attention during the week more so than seeking his kingdom, laying up treasures in heaven? Now, I know there's been a time that I know in my life, I didn't know how to lay up treasures in heaven. So I had to say, no, I'm not doing that. It's stuff on this earth is more important. And Jesus says, I understand that. That's why I'm talking to you. I want you to reverse that. Make this your priority. It's got to be first place. So it's not but plus. Now, well, why? He says, because everything you store up on this earth is subject to loss. He says, don't lay up treasures on the earth, where he says, moths and rust destroy, and thieves break in and steal. See, it's a matter of moths, rust, and thieves. If not one, the other will get them. Here is an old Mercedes-Benz. It's a real expensive car in its day, but would you give $10 for it now? Maybe for the metal, that's all. And everything in life is subject to such decay. Did you know in the Wild West that we have all these pictures in the movies of banks being robbed? And it's, man, very few were ever robbed. Less probably than a dozen from what history says. One, because there weren't very many banks in the Wild West, because they weren't safe. And today, each year, there's about 5,000 bank robberies in the United States. 98% of those people get caught. The crime doesn't pay, all right? Now, what am I talking about? If you knew the local bank was going to get robbed every week this year, would you put your money in there? No, that would not be a good investment, all right? He said, well, FDIC will insure it. No, given that all aside, would you put your money there? No. Well, we can see it when it's obvious short-term loss. We have to have that wide or long-term perspective too. Everything that you store up here will be lost. Every bit of it. It'll decay while you're here. Someone will steal it, or you'll lose it when you die. Ann tells about a friend of their family, a rich seed farmer in the valley here, worth millions of dollars. She told the story yesterday where we're driving through the valley. And he died, and his son inherited all the millions. And in a short while, due to gambling and alcoholism, he spent it all. And it just affirms what Jesus is saying. You can't take it with you. And when you leave it, someone else will just lose it altogether. Now, I want you to consider one thing that we can skip over. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on this earth. It's not so bad having a treasure, but when it's a treasure for yourself. Do you see that? And that reminds me of Luke chapter 12. I just want you to peek at that text. We won't read all of it. It's a story of this this rich fool is what they call it. Because Jesus is talking about covetousness here. And he makes some very interesting comments for our consideration. First of all, in verse 15 of Luke chapter 12. Beware and be on guard against every form of greed. And here's the first thought. Even when one has an abundance, his life does not consist of his possessions. My life does not consist, my identity, my self-worth and value is not tied to an abundance of wealth on this earth. Has no connection. Life is based on other values. The second thing is, there has been no study, no direct correlation between happiness and lots of happiness tied to lots of wealth. There's no connection. Actually, we'll see it's usually the opposite. The more people have, the sadder and more problems they have. And that's what Jesus is saying. Don't go there. Now, if you have treasures, that's one thing. Now, this fella, his treasures were all for himself because he had a great harvest. He said in verse 18, I'll just tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Verse 19, and I'll say to my soul, soul, you've got many goods laid up for many years to come. Take, eat, and drink, and be merry. Were those treasures for himself? And here's what God said to him. It reminds me of this farmer Ann was talking about. You fool. You fool. This night your soul's required. You're going to die. And now who will own what you have prepared? So here's Jesus' commentary, and it's spoken for our benefit. So is the man, you and me, who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. Who's the truly rich person? That one has a lot of wealth on this earth, but is bankrupt and poor towards God, or the person that lives in poverty, but has a rich relationship, treasures in heaven. True wealth is the latter, isn't it? Now, here's what we have to understand. This is the ironic thing. That if you seek first the kingdom of God, and you follow Christ and follow his principles in your life, often you will acquire treasures on this earth. And it's not because that was your purpose, it's a byproduct of following Christ. There are a lot of wealthy people in the Bible. Let me give an example. In Colossians chapter 3, it says, when you work, here's how I want you to work. You don't work for the man. You don't work following the clock. You're not men pleasers. You work for the Lord. You work as hard as you can, just like Jesus did when he walked on this earth. You give 12 hours for a 10-hour day if you have to. You do 110%, and Christ will reward you. We're going to study tonight, just briefly, about stewardship and being faithful. And when you're faithful, then in that which has been given to you by another, you will have return on your investment. So here's what happens. A lot of Christians, because they're following God's principles about truth and honesty and faithfulness and working hard, they acquire wealth just because it comes with following Christ. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's not their goal. It's just a byproduct of being faithful. Now, that's not always true. Some countries, it's very difficult to do that. But here in America, we see it happen often. And so that's what he's saying. Don't go there. You're going to lose them. Don't be the young rich fool. But here's the positive statement. You can accumulate in two places. You can accumulate stuff, things, wealth here on this earth. And we see that all around us. And as you get older, you say, I want to declutter. I want to downsize. I hear that all the time from people my age. They're tired of stuff. It just messes their life up. It's just too hard to manage it all. But you can accumulate stuff on this earth, and we don't think about this enough. enough. We don't talk about it. Or you can accumulate things in heaven. Do you realize that? You can accumulate wealth in heaven. Isn't that what it says? The not but clause is don't accumulate on this earth. Don't make that your priority. If it comes, fine. If it doesn't, fine. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to store up for yourself treasures in heaven. The word store up means treasure. Treasure up yourself treasures in heaven. And therefore, who? Who are you treasuring them up for? Yourself. You know, the reason I'm a Christian, first of all, I'll be honest, is for me. I want to live with my God. I want to go to heaven. Without faith that he is, and he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, you can't please him. So I not only believe that God is, I believe that he'll reward me if I follow him. I'm laying up treasures for myself. Does that make me selfish? Now here's the paradox. He says, if you want treasures in heaven, deny yourself while you're on the earth. You delay your gratification till then, you be a servant right now. And we'll get to that in just a second. Because if it's about now, you're laying up treasures for your earth, you're going to miss on heaven. But if you deny yourself now, I'll give you treasures. This word treasure is amazing too. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul uses the phrase unfathomable riches. I love that word, unfathomable. Because as a preacher, I can't say any more. How do you describe unfathomable? You can't, because I can't fathom it. If I can't fathom it, I can't explain it to you. It's beyond our imagination, and that's how it speaks about your inheritance waiting for you in heaven. Wow. So here we are. We're on the earth just for a little while. I know I'm going. God says, I want you to be a servant of mine. I want you to not worry about treasures on this earth. I want you to store up treasure in heaven. And we're going to ask how we're going to do that. And you're going to be rich beyond your imagination. Not with money, but in true wealth and true glory. And it's going to give purpose to our life. So it's in heaven. We're going to reap many times more. And he says, here's the reason. He says, because it's not subject to loss. Where he says, neither moss or rust or thieves will break in or steal. These are eternal. Everything on earth you will lose. Always. Always, every time. Someone dies, you say, well, how much did he leave? Well, that's the answer. Everything. Well, I know that. Then we wonder how much he left to his children. No, he left everything. He can't take anything with him. But when we lay up treasures in this bank in heaven, if you would, all of it will be there. And the investment, not like your RIAs or your 401ks, it will multiply so much. It's unfathomable how much these investments will pay off. And that's what he's talking about here in these kind of terms where we're trying to understand. Now, there's two reasons, because first of all, it's all about our eyes. Look what he says in verse, first of all, verse 21. For where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be. This is the bottom line reason. It's a heart issue. It's what are you seeking? Who do you love? Where's your priority? Because wherever your treasure, that's where your heart will be. That's what you'll think about. That's what you'll work towards. It's either or. It's not both. It's one or the other. And he gives us two examples. First of all, verse 22, the lamp of the body is the eye. And therefore your eye, if it's clear, your whole body will be full of light. That's the positive. Here's the negative. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness, and therefore the light that is in you is darkness. How great is that darkness? You say, well, that sounds very poetic, but I have no clue what he's talking about. What's a dark eye and a good eye? Well, in their day, someone that had a dark, evil eye is someone that looked at others with greed and covetousness. Anytime someone got and they were not able to get, they looked at him with darkness in their eye, just felt bad about themselves and evil towards them. They felt bad because of envy, and sometimes they would take steps to take from others so they could acquire for themselves. Whether it's using the laws of the land to steal or to steal outright. And so when you have an evil eye, a dark eye, your whole life becomes dark. It affects everything you do. The double entendre here is this. If an evil eye is about greed and selfishness and covetousness, what's a eye that's full of light? It's one the opposite, and here's our first clue that we're going to get to about how to lay up treasure. It's about generosity. The bad eye is looking to take and acquire and accumulate. The good eye is looking to give. See, they're opposites, aren't they? The first issue is about what kind of eye do you look at the world with? How do you see this world? Is it an opportunity to get? Or it's an opportunity to give? So how much should I give? Well, think about Jesus. Although he was rich, he became poor for our sakes, that through his poverty we might become rich. He gave it all. And so the second issue, though, is not about your eyes. It's about what he says is in verse 24. It's about your masters. No one, don't try it. You can't do it. You can't balance it. No one can serve two masters. It's impossible. Two masters. You can't have two husbands. You can't have two wives. You can't have two employers. Our boss is telling you at the same time. You have to have one. And it's either God, Jesus in heaven, or somebody on this earth. Here he says you're going to hate the one or love the other, hold to one, despise the other. And here he says specifically, you cannot serve God and serve money. That's mammon. You can't serve both. You can't seek God in his kingdom and serve money in any way. So I go back to it. Here's the second question we have to ask ourselves. The first one is what? Am I seeking his kingdom first in my life? Is my energy, my prayer, my thoughts when I get up, is it about getting stuff, getting ahead, or is it about God's kingdom? The second question is, look at my life and take inventory. What have I accumulated? Have I accumulated lots of things on this earth, but very little in heaven? Or have I accumulated great wealth in heaven and very little on this earth? The third one is, maybe I got some on this earth, but it's only because I have great wealth in heaven. And he said, well, I can't answer that because I don't even know how to accumulate wealth in heaven. But what's exciting I want you to see here is you can store up treasures in heaven. You can treasure up treasures in heaven. And that's what we want to see. Because wherever your treasure is, that's where your affection is going to be, your heart, right? And so how are we going to do this? That's the real question. And that goes back to where we started. You can have eternal treasures in heaven by simple acts of service that we perform on this earth. Well, what do you mean, simple acts? Let's first just state the principle, and then we'll look at Jesus' example of how it's done. First of all, back at the rich man in Luke chapter 12. Remember he said, you fool, because you weren't rich towards God, even though you were rich on this earth. Later in the same chapter, he gives the same instructions that were found in Matthew 6. We're in verse 31 now. So read with me. But seek first for his kingdom, and these things, food, shelter, and clothing, will be added to you. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. And here it is, verse 33. Sell your possessions, give to charity, that's the poor, that's giving alms to help those in need. And by doing so, you'll make yourselves purses or money belts which will never wear out. They're not subject to moth or rust. And an unfailing treasure in heaven. That word unfailing, when you look it up, it comes from the idea of something left behind. That broken down Mercedes. Did you leave it behind? Why? Because it was rusted. It didn't run anymore. And everything we have on this earth will leave behind But he says these acts of charity, and we'll describe what they are, you will be able to take them with you. They'll not be left behind. They're actually stored up in your spiritual bank account in heaven, if I can use that analogy. Where no thief comes near, nor moths destroy. And he repeats what he said. For where your treasure is, if it's in heaven, that's where your heart's going to be. And the reason a lot of people don't store up treasures in heaven because their heart's still on this earth. The reason a lot of people don't think about heaven is because they have no treasures in heaven. Because if their treasure's not there, their heart's not there. Does that make sense? Isn't that what he said? Your heart's where your treasure is. If we're not excited and talking about heaven and thinking about it, it's because we don't have any treasures there yet. They're all down here. It's all a package deal. Let's look at the next verse in chapter 14. In verse 13 through 14. Very similar, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. He says, when you give a reception, don't invite your friends and your neighbors because they're just going to pay you back. How are they going to pay you back? When you have people over for a big steak and a nice barbecue outside, they go, oh man, now we got to have them over to our house, right? And they pay you back, right? He says, don't do that. That's not how you lay up treasures in heaven. That's just, equity here on this earth. Verse 13, but when you give reception, invite the poor, invite the crippled, because they're always begging, and the lame, and the blind. These are the guys that are sitting at the gate beautiful asking for alms. Why? Because they can't work, they can't provide for themselves. They need others to provide for them. You invite them, and verse 14, you'll be blessed. Since they do not have the means to repay you, they can't invite you back. They won't. They do not have the means to repay you, but you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. You are laying up treasures where? In heaven. By simple acts. They're so easy. They're within the power of everyone sitting here. It's just inviting someone like that over. Feeding those that can't feed themselves. Being a kind, compassionate soul to those who need compassion and kindness. It's so simple, but it's lost in the big picture of this hubbub on this earth. So the youngest ruler, Matthew chapter 19, we know his story. Lord, what I need to do in territorial life. So what does Scripture say? He said, well, I've done all those things. What am I lacking? And what does Jesus say in Matthew 19, verse 21? We know it. But let's let Jesus read and speak to us again and affirm what we're saying, because this is his proposition, it's not mine. Jesus said to him, verse 21, if you wish to be complete. He doesn't deny that he's followed the law. He acknowledges it, but if you want to complete yourself, here's what you got to do. Sell your possessions, not necessarily all of them, because you'd be homeless, right? Then he's the needy. But sell some of your wealth. And what are you going to do with it? Give to the poor. Give to the poor. And here it is. You will have treasures in heaven. Come follow me. It's that simple. It's not hard. It's not difficult. I don't have to memorize the Bible. I don't have to convert 1,000 people. All he's asking me to do to have treasure in heaven is just help someone. It's so simple. It's within all of our power because we all have so much income here in America especially. We're able to share if we're willing to do it. Jim Elliot says, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep. He's no fool to give what he cannot keep. What is he saying? You're going to lose it all anyway, right? To gain that which he cannot lose. He's talking about giving to lay up treasures in heaven because you're going to lose it anyway. Use it to invest in eternal things. And you will gain it and you'll never lose that. It's a beautiful thought, and that captures what Jesus is saying here. So the question is, how do I do it? It's just the little things. Matthew 25. Jesus talks about the judgment, the sheep on the right and the goats on the left. And again, we're familiar with this text, but I think it just hits the nail on the head. It just finishes this whole discussion so perfectly. He's going to say to the sheep on the right in verse 34, this is the judgment scene. So we're seeing what really matters in God's great court of judgment. The righteous God, when he's rewarding those who followed him and then those that didn't, no reward. He says, come, you are blessed of my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Then he says this most challenging thing, because these people are listening to Jesus talk, and Jesus says, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. He says, I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous are going to answer, Lord, I got a question. Can you see them raising their hand? Lord, when did we see you hungry and fed you? And when did we see you thirsty and gave you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger, invite you in, or naked and clothe you? And when were you sick and we visited you? And when were you in prison and we came to you? See, that's what they're asking. Right, good question, right? And we know the answer. And if not, let's read what he says. The king will answer, and he's talking to you and me when he says this. Truly I say to you, everyone sitting right here, to the extent that you did it to the one of these brethren of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So this is what's so powerful. When I encounter hungry brethren, any time brethren, and I think personally it extends to those in the world. And we can make that case from the Good Samaritan, that story when the question was, who's my neighbor? It's anyone you meet that's in need. So if you encounter someone that's hungry, what's the simple act that you can do to actually make a deposit in heaven? Just feed them. Really, that's all? Yeah, unfathomable riches. I mean, just a little food? Yes. Well, how about if someone's thirsty? Just give them a drink. Now, we have to keep this in context. Probably these people are hungry because they're being persecuted. Maybe they're thirsty because similar things. And it doesn't have to be that, but that's fits the context. That's why they're in prison. They're in prison because of their faith, right? It's not because they've done something wrong. They're in prison because they've been following Christ and are being persecuted for it. But it's not always that, because we're going to look at somebody says, I'm a stranger. People come in, and they're Christians. And say, well, I don't know you, so why would I accept you? No, you extend yourself to them. You have them over. You make them feel part of the family. And when you're doing it, yes, we're doing it to Christ. Isn't that what he says? But we're also what? Laying up treasures in heaven. We're treasuring up treasures. Then he says naked, give them something to wear. Again, that fits the context of a persecution, but it didn't have to be. It could be just because they're down and out, they're because of circumstances beyond their control. But sick is certainly that one. Someone's sick. You know, the simplest thing you can do when someone is sick is just visit them. Now, you can't go there and make them well. You might be able to bring them some food, especially for their family, since that person maybe can't cook for them. But sometimes it's just being by their side, sitting with them and saying a prayer. That's all you can do is visit the sick. Visit means more than just visit. It means try to meet their needs while they're sick. That's the context of visiting in the New Testament. But it's so simple. It's within our grasp, but it means I have to sacrifice my time from something I was doing, storing up treasures for myself, in order to go visit you. It takes energy and it takes sacrifice and self-denial, but it's so simple. And every time you do it, there's another treasure in heaven. You deposit it. Now, let me tell you, warn you, don't do it just to get the ka-chink, the deposit. You have to do it out of sincerity and compassion, but there will be a deposit with the right motive and the right heart. So if someone's in prison, we go to them. Now, their day, that was a challenge, because if you were in jail, if Steve was in jail because of preaching Christ and they're going to kill him, what's the last thing you want to do? I don't want to be associated with Steve because they'll identify me as a Christian and I'll be in jail with him. I don't care. He's my brother, and I'm going to pray with him and encourage him if he's in jail. Give him the opportunity, right? It's a little act of service, but it shows I'm seeking first his kingdom, and I don't care about this world and what you may do to me, because my treasures are laid up somewhere else. It's so simple, but yet it's so powerful. As we bring this to close, yeah, there's tests in this life. Yes, we have trials, but they're only to teach us life lessons. And one of the lessons the Lord wants us to learn is we're here just for a little while, and things in this world do not matter. They're really of no eternal consequence, because we know when it's all said and done, I'm going to lose them all. It's been said by the man who wrote The Treasure Principle, speaking about this passage. He says, I'm convinced the greatest deterrent to giving on this world is the illusion the earth is our home. Why would I give what is mine if this world's my home? Why would I give it away? See, that's the delusion. This world is not my home. I'm going to lose it anyway. So I'm willing to give it away now to obtain eternal rewards. So when you consider that, where your heart, Jesus said, that's where your treasure is. Your heart will be where your treasure is. And real wealth, spiritual wealth, real value is accumulated in heaven by these simple acts of service. And in many ways, it's the ultimate retirement package, isn't it? If the stock market goes down, sorry, Steve, I'll feed you if you're hungry. But right, isn't it subject, y'all are retirement here on so many different factors that are beyond our control? This is the perfect retirement package. You can make deposits, and it'll always be there, and it grows exponential. It's unfathomable how much it's going to grow. It's guaranteed. And actually, you don't have to pay anything. There's no premium, is there? It's just my little acts of service. It's so simple, yet so powerful. It's divine. It's what God is asking us to do, to follow him. I hope this registers with all of us, and we love one another here, this congregation. Let's still excel still more. Let's seek God and his kingdom and his righteousness first place above all things. If you're with us and you realize, man, I got to stand before the judge someday. You're going to, all of us. And I can decide what my answer is going to be right now. And so we got to prepare. And if we could help you make that preparation so you can start accumulating wealth in heaven, won't you come as we stand and sing?